Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome back. We're continuing on in our third unit in this class, which is Applied Ethics, which is basically going to be trying to apply those ethical theories that we learned in the last unit to some real life contemporary ethical issues that we're facing today. This lecture is going to be particularly timely because we're going to be trying to talk a little bit about the nature of discrimination and oppression, most specifically in the United States. And today's lecture is going to be about, well, the ethics of discrimination and oppression and how this stuff shows up in our political structures and in our everyday life. So if you haven't already watched or listened to the song that is in my lecture notes for this lecture, go ahead and do that first and try to kind of think about what that song has to do with this lecture today and the reading that you just did by Charles Mills. So, again, we're talking about the philosopher Charles Mills today, and the excerpt that you read is from his book called The Racial Contract. Charles Mills is a Jamaican contemporary political philosopher, and he's really interesting in kind of criticizing the political ideology of classical liberalism, more specifically, the political analysis that this guy was doing in the 20th century named John Rawls, who ended up becoming a really important and influential political figure in the West. He has talked about criticisms of Rawlsian ideal theory, as well as the philosophy of race and how race intersects and affects politics. So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's lecture. Some general notes before we begin. There's a lot of kind of background information that I think would be really useful in understanding what Mills is doing exactly in this piece. So I'm going to go over that first, because although he does provide kind of his own overview of a lot of what's going on in the background, he doesn't get into it very specifically and very thoroughly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for you, just so you can kind of understand the lay of the land before we're talking about some of the criticisms that he's going to be laying out in this piece. So, up until kind of the 20th and 19th century, and even kind of going into the 19th century, there was this kind of idea that states and governments were formed in a certain way. Uh, the story goes a little bit something like this. Hypothetically, before states and communities and governing bodies are formed, humans find themselves in what a lot of philosophers have called the state of nature. And the state of nature is just supposed to be this hypothetical mode of existence that people are living and persisting in, that affects how they live, act, and see the world, uh, bereft of any ruling body or governmental authority. So this is supposed to describe this idea, the state of nature is supposed to describe how humans see and act within the world when they don't have a state or a government legislating what they can and cannot do. Various political philosophers have talked about what this state of nature would be like. Some think, like Hobbes, that it would be violent. He says the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short because people would be at each other's throats competing for resources. And then some people, like Rousseau, think that people were basically chill before we started setting up states and governments. And we were actually a lot better off back then than we are now. I'm not going to really get into that, but kind of keep the idea of the state of nature in your head as you are listening to this lecture. The historical trend about how states and governments are set up have kind of followed this idea that there were humans in the state of nature. For some reason, they decided they didn't want to be in the state of nature anymore and they wanted to set up a ruling body in a state. So that's what they did. This idea, this view that people kind of decided to group together and form a contract of sorts of what people could do in the community and what would be lawful and stuff is called social contract theory. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy uh, explains it this way. Social contract theory is the view that people's moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them that they form among themselves to form the society in which they live. So, social contract theory basically says at some point in human history, humanity decided to create a state with certain laws under which we would all be politically equal and bound to the same rules and regulations. Traditional social contract theory uh, presumes kind of a liberal understanding of what it means to be human. And this is something that we see Held criticize in her piece, The Ethics of Care, right? Uh, to believe that at some point humans decided to set up a state in which they would all be equal under the law conceptualizes people in a way that they are autonomous, rational beings who kind of all experience the same treatment under the law and they experience the same privileges given to them by statehood. This was the prevailing theory about how states were supposed to operate and how they came about and what people's relationships were to the state. If you've read the uh, introduction and the overview of the racial contract, which I assigned today, you would know that Mills is basically going to argue against this theory. He's going to say what that stuff is describing is ideal theory. That's how it would go ideally if people were good and playing by the rules and following their own laws. That is not actually what happens in reality, according to Mills. The origins of the state and government are actually much more insidious, according to Mills. He's going to describe how the social contract actually exists, how relationships between individuals actually inform the origins of the state. And he's going to try to describe how the history of state formation have caused us to build up and legitimize systems of oppression and domination that we see in the industrialized Western world. He's going to argue that the actual social contract we have was designed mostly by white people for white people at the expense of everyone else. And that's kind of going to be the main idea of today's lecture and the main idea of this book, The Racial Contract. He's going to attempt to explain, quote, the actual genesis of the society and the state, the way society is structured, and the way the government functions, and people's moral psychology. Analogously to Held, who thinks that there's kind of like a female or a women's perspective missing from the ethical theories that we looked at in last unit, Mills is going to say that political philosophy generally has been missing non-white perspectives since basically in the history of philosophy, it was a bunch of old white dudes that thought this stuff up and taught it to their peers and convinced their peers. Mills is going to say that actually, if we take the experiences of people of color into account and how they see the world, they're going to provide us with a much different and more accurate story about how the United States and other Western industrialized nations came to be and how that only came to be on account of the exploitation of other social groups and other races. So, the way Mills is going to back up these claims is he's going to provide a historical analysis of imperialism and colonialism and stuff like that. So that's kind of a general overview of the historical context in which Mills is writing. And he wrote this book pretty recently in the 90s, actually. But he was kind of disenchanted with the way that political philosophers were understanding and treating how it is that the United States, for example, came about and what the United States owes in its formation to other social groups and its imperialistic practices. So let's go ahead and jump into what the text says more specifically now. And I'm just going to kind of run through the main ideas of what Mills is expressing in the introduction and the overview to this book, The Racial Contract. Mills is interested and has a vested interest in trying to support three main claims or theses in this book. The first is that white supremacy exists both locally and globally and has existed for many years. The second is that white supremacy should itself be thought of as a political system, not just a cognitive orientation or a belief, but a political system that organizes society in a certain way, namely in a way that has been disadvantageous for non whites. And finally, he's going to try to argue that, quote, as a political system, white supremacy can illuminatingly be theorized as based on a contract between whites, that is, a racial contract. And we're going to spell out through the course of this lecture what exactly Mills is getting at when he's trying to talk about what the racial contract means and in what the racial contract consists. For him, there's going to be three parts to that, but I'll get to that here in a little bit. Before I kind of jump into the gripes that Mills has with traditional social contract theory and why he thinks it doesn't represent reality, I'd like to clarify what Mills means when he says white supremacy. So there's this idea in our culture, and this is kind of an artifact from before we were alive, but we still see it today, is the idea that what white supremacy means is somebody consciously thinking that the white race is top dog and that all other races are inferior or something, and they consciously act that out in the world. That is not what Mills means when he's talking about white supremacy. For him, white supremacy and how white supremacy shows up in the world doesn't even need to be like a conscious or intentional thing. For Mills, what he means by white supremacy is not necessarily that white people think of themselves consciously as superior to other races, but rather the way white supremacy shows up in reality is the sustainment of social and political policies that happen to privilege whites over other races. And one of the main points that Mills is going to be making throughout this is that it's not an accident that the way our society is set up, that white people have a bunch of privileges that other people don't. He's going to say that consciously or unconsciously, that was actually kind of by design, and it was set up by white people to be like that. This is a rather controversial topic and a really controversial claim, I think, to make, though I think a lot of people in the United States specifically are kind of warming up to it and kind of taking it on. So don't feel like that if you happen to be white, that Mills is attacking you here. He's not trying to make people feel bad about what's going on exactly. He's just trying to describe the way that the world is, or the way that he sees the world, according to the research and experiences that he has had as a black man. And he's trying to bring to light some of the things that he sees black people as saying for many, many years. So think of this lecture not as like oh, you're bad and you need to fix the way you're living. Think of it more as just kind of like an investigation in exactly how our society is structured and what that means for which racial and social groups we belong to. Okay, so the best way to kind of describe what Mills has going on here is to compare what he calls the racial contract to how philosophy and political theorists have in the past traditionally conceptualized how states and governments arise in social contract theory in general. So the traditional view, the traditional social contract theory view, is that uncivilized people living in the state of nature somehow enter into a contract with one another to live together and set up a state or a ruling body under which they receive certain protections and privileges and have their rights defended at the cost of giving up some of their liberties, right? This is kind of what the traditional social contract view is. And there are a few different parts to what kind of implications this social contract has for society and how we should treat one another. So the social contract that Mills is going to describe It basically has three parts, and he's going to draw out the three main parts in traditional social contract theory and then in the racial contract that he's interested in expressing and bringing to light. So, the first part of the political contract, the social contract, is that it is political. Uh, the social contract that we set up between ourselves and those around us stipulates how we are to behave in society to fellow humans. Um, it's supposed to set up a state in which we are all equal under the law, and we all have a certain absolute worth and have certain freedoms and rights that are to be respected. The social contract also has a moral dimension. It tries to stipulate which laws are just and unjust, and how to set up laws that conform with our sense of morality. According to this idea called natural law theory, which saturates a lot of social contract theory, uh, most social contract theories stipulate that all people are created equal, they all have unalienable rights that we're not supposed to violate, and we're all supposed to be treated equally under the law. This is kind of the moral dimension of the social contract. Excuse me. Finally, there's an epistemological dimension of the contract. And what this dimension is supposed to capture is what the social contract prescribes for us to think about the society that in which we live and the society that we have set up. That is, the social contract also prescribes for us certain ways of understanding what exactly we're doing by constructing a society in this way. And the traditional social contract invites us to think that everyone, again, everybody is an autonomous, rational individual that is equal under the law. And furthermore, it presumes that, quote, there is an understanding about what counts as a correct, objective interpretation of the world. And for agreeing to this view, one is granted full cognitive standing in the polity and right to political participation. So there's this idea that, look, we've set up a society in which everyone is free and equal and deserves the same treatment under the law, uh, but also we need to be able to have a certain nuanced and complex understanding of the world in order to be deserving and engaging in political participation. So you have to see the world a certain way, and that certain way is that everybody's free, we have freedoms, we're cool, and if we recognize that, and if we understand the world well enough, we are granted the privilege to decide what happens uh, in politics and in the state that we have set up for ourselves. This is the traditional social contract view, what the traditional social contract theory tries to get us to understand about ourselves and the world. However, this doesn't actually match up with reality according to Mills. According to Mills, the universe and the way that we have set up states and organizations and political bodies is much more insidious and complex than this. According to Mills, the actual social contract that humans historically have set up with themselves have made it such that uh, and this is a historic actuality according to Mills. People in power, which have been historically whites, have set up a contract amongst themselves only to live together and to set up a state under which they receive protection, have their rights defended at the cost of giving up some of their liberty, etc. However, um, the idea is that what separates this view from the traditional social contract theory is that the way that states have been organized uh, in the universe in which we live actually has mostly been dominated by white interests in the exploitation of underprivileged groups and people of color. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more here by outlining the different dimensions of the actual social contract in comparison to the the dimensions that we just talked about with the traditional social contract theory. So, the political dimension of the actual social contract that we have set up for ourselves is that it stipulates how whites are to behave in society with whites and other non whites. According to Mills, the real social contract, which he calls the racial contract, partitions individuals into categories of white and non white. At the outset, it is not as if everybody saw everybody else as equal to them under the law and deserving of the same privileges. Historically, in actuality, Mills is going to argue that the way Western society has been constructed is that, consciously or unconsciously, it has been constructed in such a way so as to privilege whites and disadvantage those who are non-white. So, uh, historically, he says that the establishment of the social contract has involved civilized whites colonizing a land and taking it over from the savage non-whites. And we've seen this throughout human history in the colonizations of Africa, India, and the Americas, right? Um, and the general story that the colonizers have told themselves has been something like this. Uh, the white colonizer sees the savage non-white as persisting in the state of nature, something that they still haven't left. They see the non-white generally of the land that they're trying to colonize as stupid or brutish or uncultured or uncivilized, and they take it over from the savage non-whites for various reasons. Um, one of the, some of the reasons why historically, or some of the motivations that have incited this kind of colonizing practice is that the white colonizer has historically seen the savage non-white as persisting in the state of nature, ignorant and childlike, and in certain need of help or guidance, with the idea that, oh, we need to save them from themselves, or we need to teach them how to be cultured, or something like that. Those were the actual motivations a lot of time of, or at least justifications for engaging in the kind of imperialist behavior we have seen throughout history. There have also been other motivations, such as economic, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Thus, according to Mills, the racial contract establishes a racial polity, a racial state, and a racial juridical system where the status of whites and non-whites is clearly demarcated, whether by law or custom. So one of the points that Mills is trying to get us to realize in this piece is that when racial discrimination and segregation and oppressive things happen to people in Western society, it's not because that's a deviation from the way that we actually treat people, or a deviation of our liberal ideology that has been deeply ingrained in us. Rather, race and racial discrimination have played a part in constructing how society has been constructed throughout history. And racial politics is actually embedded in the system from the get go. There's a reason things are the way they are for whites and non whites. And what Mills is trying to say here is that that has happened because it has been brought about that way, consciously or unconsciously, by those in power, which have been historically white people. He says, the purpose of this state, the actual state in which we live, by contrast with the neutral state of classic contractarianism, is specifically to maintain and reproduce this racial order, securing the privileges and advantages of the full white citizens and maintaining the subordination of non-whites. So the idea that we have a bunch of underprivileged people in the United States, for example, that are people of color, is not an accident. It was actually built to be this way. And the way that we operate in society actually further reproduces this structure. He says, in addition, the general purpose of the contract is always the differential privileging of the whites as a group with respect to the non-whites as a group, the exploitation of the non-whites' bodies, land, resources, and the denial of equal socioeconomic opportunities to them. So really what Mills is trying to get across here is that this system has been built such that certain groups, whites, have been given much more privilege than other groups, and that it has been designed in this way, in some sense. So that is the political dimension of the racial contract. We can also talk about the moral and the epistemological dimensions. And if you're waiting for evidence of these claims, I'm going to talk about that at the end of the lecture. So don't just think I'm, spouting off what Mills says without providing any evidence. That's going to come in a little bit. So, the moral dimension of the social contract looks a little bit something like this. Historically, according to Mills, the racial contract, prescribes whites to think of other races as either subhuman or non-human, so that they have an inferior moral status, and the rules don't really apply equally to everybody. If society has been based on this idea, largely, at least in the beginning, that the native inhabitants of this land and the slaves that Americans brought over from Africa were subhuman or non-human, that means that we can treat them less than human, which is something that we've seen throughout history, right? With the decimation of the Native Americans and us kind of stealing their land from them, as well as the slavery that we forced African peoples to engage in. The idea that there's some moral egalitarianism in our society, that all men are created equal, have unalienable rights, and all have a certain amount of absolute value and worth, that only applies to those in our society that pass as white. For those in society for which our society has been built. Historically, non-whites have been seen as unfree and unequal, as savage and uncultured, and thus they have been subordinated with respect to white people. So the racial contract not only orders society politically to benefit whites, it also encourages us or invites us to think that people that are not white, that don't fit into the category of white, don't deserve the same kind of treatment that whites do. Finally, and this is probably the most interesting part of all this, which is why if you're politically conservative or haven't encountered these arguments before, might be quite a shock to you. And that's because there's an epistemological element to the racial contract as well. Mills says that the contract prescribes, quote, for its signatories, which are mostly white people, people that kind of sign on to this way of constructing society and engaging in politics and economics, it prescribes for them what he calls an inverted epistemology, and an epistemology of ignorance, which produces the ironic outcome that whites in general will be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. The way this inverted epistemology shows up in the minds of whites is something like this. Whites are educated in school and through social practices and activities to misrepresent the world as a racially equal order, and to ignore the history of white colonialism and imperialism and the early racism of our founding fathers, and how those beliefs and psychological motivations influenced the political, economic, and social structure of Western society today. These narratives, as we have seen, the idea that everybody's equal under the law, that there's no racial hierarchy, that we were pretty good people in the past, we are prescribed this view of the world from the racial contract so we can basically keep on doing the things that we're doing without feeling bad or without coming to terms with the deeply negative moral activity that our ancestors engaged in. Mills says, quote, "One can say then as a general rule that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few hundred years, a cognitive and moral economy psychically required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And these phenomena are in no way accidental, but prescribed by the terms of the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity." So, what Mills is trying to get across to us here is that the way we have structured society invites us and encourages us to forget about the historical activities our ancestors engaged in to make the United States what it is today. We are encouraged to forget about slavery. We are encouraged to forget about the fact that our economic prosperity was basically built off the exploitation of those that we thought were subhuman or non-human, aka non-whites. So those are the dimensions of the racial contract. It organizes society in a racial hierarchy and tries to produce that. It takes non-whites or presumes them to be non-human or subhuman, and thus we can kind of justify any kind of treatment that we want of them. And it prescribes to us an inverted epistemology that gets us to misrepresent the world so we can justify to ourselves that the way society is operating right now is good and okay and should be the way that it is. Mills doesn't just stop there, though, of course. He doesn't just spout all of this head theory and leave it. There's a lot of historical evidence for these claims, and he puts a little bit of this evidence in the book, and I'm going to be talking about that now. The evidence that I'm going to bring up now is supposed to support the claim that, quote, "We live in a world which has been foundationally shaped for the past 500 years by the realities of European domination and the gradual consolidation of global white supremacy." What are the pieces of evidence for this? Well, look at the history of colonization, more specifically European colonization, which has been the most prevalent and most intense. We see historically the colonization of the Americas and Asia, Africa, and the Pacific throughout world history. And we have seen differential treatment afforded to native inhabitants, right? When Europeans first started settling India, for example, or Africa, or the Americas, the native inhabitants were treated pretty shittily, and if they weren't enslaved, they were normally killed. Now, that's not saying that all Europeans treated them that way, but that was kind of the norm back then, and it was accepted, and it was even encouraged by a lot of philosophers and theologians and pastors and popes. He says, in all cases, race is the common conceptual denominator that gradually came to signify the respective global statuses of superiority and inferiority, privilege and subordination. There is an opposition of us against them with multiple overlapping dimensions. European versus non-European, for example, which shows up in geographical analyses. Civilized versus the wild, savage, or barbarian culture. Wild, savage, or barbarian peoples, which has to do with culture. Christianity versus heathens, which has to do with religion. But they all eventually coalesced into the basic opposition, he says, of white versus non-white. In almost all of these instances where Europeans were engaged in this kind of mental opposition attitude, it basically ended up boiling down to, well, do they look like the same color as us? And more often than not, if they didn't, we treated them pretty badly. The racial contract also shows up in this idea of European and more contemporarily American exceptionalism. This idea that we're the best and smartest because we come from European stock and we've made all these great inventions and technologies, and we did an awesome job in the Industrial Revolution and generated a bunch of wealth for ourselves. What that idea misses, and what the racial contract invites us to think about, is that we are only able to think of ourselves as exceptional because our culture and our state and our society was built off of the backs of making people work for us and stealing resources from other lands. Um, it's not always the case that Europeans or other colonizers did that, but again, that was pretty much the norm historically. Evidence that the racial contract exists and that discrimination and oppression is still with us today can also be found in the tendency of Europeans to engage in what's called cultural imperialism. And this is something that Iris Marion Young talks about in her book, Five Faces of Oppression. This idea that our culture is better than their culture and we need to instill our cultural values onto them, and destroy their culture or get rid of their culture because it's bad or worse than ours. This is another example in which racialized uh, practices show up and kind of provides evidence for the existence of the racial contract. And then, of course, probably the most damning piece of evidence that supports this idea that our society is based or has been based on uh, privileging whites and disadvantaging non whites is the economic exploitation that Europeans and other offshoots of uh, European communities have engaged in. So, for example, there's been slavery that has been a constant problem throughout human history, and in which Europe, uh, or rather European colonizers, utilized in order to basically construct the foundations of the American economy. There's, wage labor that still goes on today that is extremely unjust and just cruel when, we think of sweatshops around the world that, even American companies are funding, to keep profits high and to keep costs low. Uh, there's redlining, right? That was a practice that was pretty common in the mid to latter half of the 20th century in the United States, right? Demarcating neighborhoods according to future economic value really disadvantaged those neighborhoods and prevented resources from being shared with them. Uh, and a lot of these communities are just extremely underfunded and dangerous because of that. There is, of course, employment, wage, and promotion discrimination. Um, you know, there have been multiple studies that have showed that two applicants with the same resume and the same credentials, the one with the white name gets twice as many callbacks as the one with a stereotypically black name. That's another example in which the racial contract manifests itself in today's culture. Um, there's racial price discrimination in housing and services and insurance, and right, felony disenfranchisement is something that we see a lot today as well. Um, Making our felons unable to participate in political participation in the United States is a color coded way of making sure that these policies and these structures aren't changed, right? In short, Mills says that both globally and within particular nations, then, white people, Europeans and their descendants, continue to benefit from the racial contract, which creates a world in their cultural image, political states differentially favoring their interests, uh, an economy structured by the racial exploitation of others, and a moral psychology not only in whites, but sometimes in non whites, also skewed consciously or unconsciously towards privileging the whites, taking the status quo of differential racial entitlement as normatively legitimate and not to be investigated further. So there's a lot of little pieces of information that I kind of want to break down in this final quote. The idea, I think, that Mills is trying to get across is not that the societies in which we live are really overtly racist and intentionally trying to put people of color down and underprivilege them. But our society has been built in such a way that those motivations and desires were certainly there from the start, and it has affected how we have structured our society, right? Poor people do not generally get a fair shake in our society, and a lot of poor people are black. That is not an accident, right? That is a consequence of historical materialism, how wealth has accrued in the hands of those that have had power, and how wealth has not been able to accrue in people that have been historically enslaved and been unable to work and create a life for themselves. We're still feeling the effects of slavery today, right? In communities of color, uh, a lot, and in other social practices. What I think Mills is trying to get us to look at by talking about this stuff is that, look, society continues to disadvantage those whose ancestors were not white, and that's a problem. While the law today is technically colorblind and doesn't mention race, uh, the way our society operates has been constructed such that those that have more power and those that have a certain amount of wealth just accrue more. And there are a bunch of people that are born, unfortunately, at a disadvantage uh, compared to white people. Again, Mills is not trying to necessarily call people out or try to make you feel bad about what's going on. He's just trying to explain kind of the political origins of Western societies and how those have been racially motivated and how they affect us racially today. Finally, the last thing that I want to note is this thing that he says about moral psychology. He says that the racial contract, um, it kind of creates a world in which there's this psychology not only in whites but also in non-whites that uh, encourages us to keep engaging in those practices that privilege whites. And this, I think, is connected to uh, what W.E.B. Du Bois calls double consciousness. As a black man, Du Bois was really interested kind of in the psychology of race. And what he found is that colonized peoples are kind of uh, being pulled in two directions. There's a sense in which they want to remain true and authentic to their ancestral culture and origins, but they also feel pulled by the dominant culture to engage in their practices and assimilate their values and their way of life. But when you try to do both of those things, kind of, uh, you're pulled in two different directions, right? And that was something that W.E.B. Du Bois experiences, and something that I think a lot of people of color experience in the United States today. Trying to do their best and operate successfully within a culture and a society that is predominantly white and ordered by white people, while also trying to connect with and remain true to what makes them who they are and where they have come from. So, the racial contract not only establishes a certain political hierarchy, but it engenders this kind of double consciousness in people of color. And it really is destructive and exploitative, I think, in many, many ways. And I think that's exactly what Mills is trying to get at here. So this is a really interesting idea. Do you think Mills is wrong? Do you think his historical analysis is just dead wrong? Do you think he's right? Do you think there's some merit to what he says? I'm definitely interested in hearing what y'all think about this lecture, because this is a pretty spicy reading. And there's a lot of interesting ideas in here. So think about this stuff, reflect on it, have conversations with your friends and your family about this stuff, see what they think. And yeah, post in the discussion boards. In any case, I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I hope the exam goes well for you and everything. I will see you on Monday. Okay, have a great weekend. Bye.